Hi there, and welcome to the HR Podcast. This is Linda Misegadis.
And Cyndi Manuel, and we'll be your co-hosts. After spending years working in and with HR, we thought, why not start a podcast to support the important HR community? We believe the way things have always been done isn't necessarily what's going to work in the future. So we're diving into topics that support HR and working women as they navigate the future of work. We're talking about professional growth and also how we can support each other as human beings.
We can't wait to bring you insights from HR experts, thought leaders, and inspiring women who are making a real difference in their organization and communities. They'll share their journeys and tips on balancing work and life in a better way. We're excited to learn alongside you and hope you'll pick up some great takeaways from tips and tricks to worksheets that you can actually use in your daily life. So grab your favorite beverage
or lace up your walking shoes and join us for the HR Her Resources podcast.
Hey, Cyndi, it's so good to be in the studio with you today. I'm so excited about our new podcast.
Me too. I feel like this has maybe been a long time coming.
I think so too. We've got such amazing history together and we've been on some pretty incredible journeys together as well through mergers and acquisitions and then leading big efforts at the city and county of Denver to then kind of going our separate ways for a little while and then finding our way back together, which I'm so happy about.
I am too. And when you came to me and said, I'm thinking about starting a podcast. What would you think about co-hosting it with me? It was yes. And so I'd love to hear a little bit of background from you about what made you kind of come up with this idea.
Yeah, I've really been throughout the last few years, maybe since COVID, kind of thinking about how do we get our voice out there to really elevate the role of human resources, but also to educate people a little bit more on human resources? Because, I certainly had my preconceived notion of human resources from back in the day. We've been in the industry for a little while. And so we've kind of grown up really watching how much it's evolved and changed. And you always heard from people like, well, HR wasn't going to be my career or payroll wasn't going to be my career. I just kind of fell into it, which was always fascinating to me. And then as we've watched how business has evolved, and then we watched what happened during COVID and the refocus back on human beings, because that was one of the things that I always thought was so amazing in organizations back in the day when there was more like, you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. So we were kind of willing to go the extra mile for our organizations because they felt like they were too. And then, things changed and you started to see a little bit of that shift. And then you would see the dynamic shift between when it was an employer market versus an employee market and who was in a position of power. And I was always thinking, like, what role is HR playing in any of this? Like, do they have a seat at the table? Because I've been in different organizations where they have, where they haven't. And then now in my current role, really kind of working with HR professionals across the country, I thought, this is such a female-dominated role, and yet the voice we listen to are still very male-driven. And so I thought, what could we do to help women feel more empowered in the role of human resources, maybe highlight those silent heroes that people don't hear about? Because again, even when you do hear about women, it's usually like this kind of untouchable. Like I remember when Sheryl Sandberg came out with the whole lean in thing, and I would listen to that and I think, well, she's got a totally different life than I do. I don't make the kind of money that she does and have all of that access to resources. And I thought, is that really the voice I want to follow? But throughout my career now, I've had this opportunity to meet these amazing women along my journey. And I'm like, those are the women that if I were my younger self, that's who I would want to follow. And so I thought, what could we do to maybe elevate that voice? And who better to do that with than you? So I was so glad that you were willing to do this with me.
I love that. And I think back, and I'm not going to say when I started in HR, but I think back and when I started in HR and back to what you were saying, I just so happened to fall into HR. In fact, at the time I was working for a manufacturer in California, great place to start your HR career in California. And I remember the lady that was going to hire me, she simply said, can you talk to people and can you draw a straight line? And I thought,
Wow.
wow, sounds pretty simple.
Yeah, right? Yeah, I
Probably
could
an
do that.
oversimplification.
Yes.
But I started doing a lot of the tactical kinds of
Okay,
things.
yeah.
And so back to the whole evolution, HR has really evolved, and I'm not even formally in HR anymore. It did lead me to where I am today. It led,
Yeah.
you and I knew each other
Absolutely,
when I
yeah.
was in HR, but I'm just so excited about where HR is heading. And I do feel like the pandemic was sort of a level playing field for some
Yes.
of that. It kind of reset some of our focus on people and,
Yeah.
how do we keep people engaged when they're not working on site and things of that nature. So, yeah, I think it's a great topic, and I would have said yes anyway, but
Oh.
it just kind of took it over
Well,
the ledge to be able to do this
no,
with you.
I was glad because I do think that as far as we've come as women, and we have come a long way. I mean, I think it's silly to live in the past and like somehow we're still completely oppressed the way that we once were. But we've not come as far as we need to go. And I think that the voice of the business is still very male dominated. Even with the
Mhm.
amazing women who have made a difference, you still don't hear those voices as dominant as you
Yeah.
do the men's voice. And you and I were chatting about this the other day, even as we were researching for the podcast, is
Yeah.
who did we see? Well, we see people like Josh Bersin and we see Dave Ulrich and the head of the SHRM organization. Those are the people who seem to have this loud voice.
Yes.
And then even from a compensation perspective, men still make more money than women do, even though it's a predominantly women,
Yeah.
dominated field. And so I thought, well, this is just kind of a fun way to highlight a little bit, but also maybe to encourage all of our female colleagues and just colleagues in general in HR to recognize that human resources does have to change.
Yeah.
They've changed the title several times, like we've been through that in our career,
Chief
right?
people
Yes,
officer and
yes.
yeah.
And how do you do that in a
Yeah.
way that you don't minimize the importance of the resources, which are human people?
Mhm.
So I know that's kind of why they came up with that whole chief people officer for a little while. But those things, those matter, those titles matter.
Absolutely.
And how
Absolutely.
you think about the role that people play, but also the balance in business is so important. So, what is HR doing to evolve and change
Yeah.
and be better,
Yeah.
honestly, and have that seat at the table so that they aren't just viewed as tactical players in the market? So,
Yeah, and I'm so excited. You and I have had conversations about people that we know in our lives that we look up to and just think the world of, who are HR leaders. And so I think a part of this will be bringing in some additional
yes,
voices around HR.
absolutely.
But I also love the idea of not just business related, but the
Yes,
holistic view of we are all people, which there is more and more. There was such a push towards work-life balance, which we now know
right.
there's no such thing as work-life balance. But really, kind of how do we incorporate work with our lives and work to live, not the opposite.
Yes.
And so I think that, bringing in some guests who might have some ideas and actionable things that we can do. I know I am very much looking forward to that.
Me too. Yes, I want our listeners to know that it's not just about what Cyndi and I think and our opinions. We
Yes.
really do want to bring in people from the business world, from human resources, from, just really around to
Yes.
hear there are some incredible things that are being done by
Yeah.
women, both old and young. And if we can provide a platform to kind of highlight some of those
Yes.
amazing things, that's what our goal is around all of this. So
Yeah. I
so
love
excited to
that.
have you on this journey with me.
Thank you. I am
Yeah,
too.
no,
Yeah. I feel like I'm
definitely.
going to learn a lot along the way.
Me too. Me too.
So,
I have learned so much every step of the way. Well, and we thought that maybe a good way to start our first episode is to think a little bit about the history of human resources and where did we come from and where are we going? Because it is kind of important to think about where you came from. So I was doing a little research and looking into like how did human resources really start? And it goes all the way back to, I feel like, the late 1700s, early 1800s, which is crazy to
Wow.
think that it's that old too, right? That
And I
we've been
thought I'd
doing.
been doing
I
HR a
know,
long time. Yeah.
exactly. But thinking about that, it was really put in place more from a safety perspective, and again, it was
Makes
very
sense.
female dominated. Women were brought in to kind of ensure that workers were safe. It wasn't really about compensation or payroll or any of that sort of stuff. It really was just about how do we
Safety.
keep our workers safe? And that's where it kind of started. And
Makes
then you kind of
sense.
watch it evolve, and you started to see more like around even child labor. Like you started to see more around rules and things that were
Right.
coming into things that were accepted in the past that weren't as much. And so now policies were coming into
Mm,
play, and well, who's going to manage those policies and thinking about that.
mm.
And then you take it a little bit further, and you started adding in things like compensation and performance, and started thinking a little bit about the strategy, but still not yet. It was still very tactical, still
Mhm.
more about hiring and terminating and rules, more than anything else.
Yeah.
And then you kind of see it evolve into being more strategic. So, like in the 80s and 90s, you started to see a little bit more strategy come into HR. So,
Yeah.
thinking about your people and hiring and all of that,
Yep.
right? And then you see it turn into, as technology came around, because I was talking to somebody the other day about when I did payroll back in the
Did you
day.
do it on like a
Handwritten,
yes.
yes, totally. I wrote it out. And of course, back then, I think we had FICA, Medicare, state and local tax, and even the 401k when it first came out, that was all manual on spreadsheets too. And we hand wrote the checks, and then we take them into the office, right, for the owner to sign the checks. It's so crazy.
And I'm
So,
not a math person, so I feel so bad for people who got paid by me
right.
back in the day, which long, long, long time ago.
Right? It's so funny to think about that. And then, technology really kind of
Mm-hmm.
really came into the forefront.
Yeah.
And that's when you started to see more data around human resources, and
Yeah.
then thinking about how do you automate processes. And
Yes.
so that kind of was an interesting turn, but still very tactical. You still didn't think of HR necessarily, like you didn't think about the VP of HR having a seat at the table with your CEO or the executive leadership
We were
necessarily.
under the CFO because
Yes.
a lot of it was so tactical to your point, but
Yeah.
monetarily, kind of focused. It was
Right.
not where it was strategic,
Yep.
like you were saying. And I do remember you and I have talked about this, the very first leader in HR that came and to the company, and you and I were both there at the
Yeah.
time. And she came in and she sat all of us down around a table in HR and she said, "We are not administrative only. We are, there's strategic stuff. We need to understand the business. We are going to have an impact in the way the business runs." And
Yeah.
my mind was blown. I thought it
Right.
was amazing. And I looked
Yes.
around the table and I did see a few faces where people just had this very big look of concern.
Right.
And she picked up on that. She was great. And she said, I get that this is a little scary.
Right.
So you either, and she did say that, and I have to be very respectful that she said, I appreciated that she said that. She said, either you're going to go on this journey with me, or the exits are clearly marked, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And people were very offended, but I thought, I'm all in. Let's do this thing.
Absolutely.
And I'm
No.
so grateful that she came in.
Right.
And years later, I had stayed in touch with her, and was an amazing mentor.
No, I think that's incredible. And you're absolutely right. And if you think back too, HR was not really respected in the organization.
Right.
Most employees didn't
Necessary evil.
trust them. Yes, they were necessary evil. They were
Yeah.
just there to do the company's bidding,
That's
right?
right.
So if somebody needed to be fired, or, you were doing a reorganization, it was
Yeah.
HR's job to do those, like the dirty work.
Mhm.
And then also, I mean, I know my impression was that most of the people who worked in HR, it seemed like a real gossipy kind of
Mm.
backbitey type of environment. And I thought, wow, these are the people who like are in charge of our people.
Yeah.
And it just didn't have that feeling that I was hoping for, that you would expect to see.
Yeah.
And then you think about once technology kind of came into play, you started to see a little bit of a shift in the role of human resources, and it did kind of free up a little bit of time to be more strategic, right?
That's such
Because
a great
now you
point.
didn't have to do all of the, it wasn't about all the paper
Manual.
pushing. Because think about our old employee files back in the day, and
Yes.
the 2-hole punch
Yeah.
and the binder clips at the top,
And
and
you knew how long somebody had been at the company based on how thick
how
their
big their
file
file
was.
was.
Yes.
Exactly. No, that is so true. And then, it kind of started to make a little bit of a shift. And then we had a global pandemic. And that really kind of, I think, changed so much because suddenly organizations had to look to human resources. They had to look to their people to figure out
Yes.
what were they going to do. And so suddenly HR got to step up. They got to do what they do really well, which is to think about, all right, what are we going to do? How do we rally the troops? How do we make
Yes.
sure that business keeps operating? Because there were essential people that had to keep working, couldn't just stop the whole country.
Taking care of
Things had to
them
happen.
and
Yes.
connecting
How were
people
we
who are
doing that?
remote and
Yeah. And think policies all of a sudden had to be changed because if you weren't used to working remote or had never been remote, I remember working in the city when we first were there, and they just had desktops, right? Like there weren't laptops. You had to check out a laptop if you wanted to take it on the road type of thing. And so thinking about how were you going to get computers to people in their homes, and then how were we going to all stay connected? So the deployment of technology, which in the past would have taken forever, suddenly happened overnight. Yes, there was this huge change. And then you had to think about the care that was going on because lives were being impacted. And so what were we going to do? How are we going to take that approach? Well, who do you talk to? You talk to your people, right?
Yes.
And so suddenly we did see a shift. I think that to me was like the catalyst for change, really, for human resources. That was significant enough to all of a sudden, there's a big focus now in human resources, which is why we're having these conversations today, right? Is thinking about like what is the future for those leaders in human resources. And if you were still doing it, like what would you hope? Like what would you wish it would look like?
Yeah, I mean, going back to what you were saying. So now I've moved into change management in 2007.
I love it.
When you called me, I was doing HR.
That's
I'm in an airport in Arizona, and I was tired of being a road warrior. And you called me from the city and said, hey, we're making this massive change. We're moving people from paper and Post-its over to this new technology.
Yes.
Do you want to come and help me to roll this thing out? And I thought, yes, I do. And so that was kind of the start of change management for me, which I didn't even know that that's what it was called at the time. But the reason I bring that up is because now I'm doing change management since 2007. When the pandemic hit, what a great representation of necessity created. We had to shift overnight pretty much, right?
Yeah.
It was an urgent need.
Yes.
People had to change. People had to shift. So from an HR perspective, I agree with you. I think it was a great opportunity for HR to step into what they were truly capable of. And there's so many amazing, caring people in HR, and they were really wanting to take care of people.
Yes.
And really make sure, again, to your point, that the business kept going. So you, from an HR perspective, you were hearing from the leaders of the organization. We have to keep the business going. We have to keep the doors open. Who's essential? Who can work from home? How do we get them set up to work from home? How do we make sure? And even at that point, I don't even think, it was sort of Maslow's hierarchy. It wasn't how do we stay connected quite yet. Now, post-pandemic, and even 4 years post-pandemic, I feel like it's more, how do we stay connected? How do we make sure people, no matter what mode they're working in, they don't feel like they're on an island. They feel like they're a part of a team, and they feel seen and they feel heard, and it doesn't feel unfair. I get to work from home. You have to come into the office. Those sorts of so a whole new barrel of monkeys, if you will, for HR. But
it really has been.
I think it has highlighted and really provided an opportunity for HR to evolve just even to that next level. So it's like tactical, strategic, and now just even more so like leadership and innovation.
Yes.
And, now you and I have talked about this before. It was HR was reporting into the CFO.
Right.
Now, most companies, and Josh Bersin shows this in his report, most HR executives report directly into the CEO, which
Yeah.
is really where they
Which makes
should be.
sense, right? I mean, like that's the epicenter of the
Right.
organization. And I think the CFO piece of it, because, we were really viewed as commodities. Employees have long been thought of as more like just a means to an end in an organization,
Yeah.
right? It was just a cog in the wheel.
Mm-hmm.
And you weren't necessarily, I don't think that companies cared, but really what they cared about was their bottom line,
That's
right?
right.
And so, but I think that when you see something like a global pandemic that had such a huge impact on
People.
people's lives and the people that had to keep things going, like I think about, the nurses and the doctors
Yes.
and, even all of your police and fire and emergency medical personnel that were
Mm-hmm.
out there. There were a lot of people that were right in the heart of all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, how were you taking care of those people? And
Yeah.
I think that that is where HR got an opportunity to shine and
Mm-hmm.
programs that have been around forever. So, I always kind of laugh a little bit about this when there's like this big highlight on wellness programs or, the employee assistance or
Yeah.
these programs have been around
Around.
forever. I
Yep.
mean, I think about
EAPs.
they were out there before we had all that technology to help
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
We were doing those programs. They just weren't, they were kind of like, yeah, that's a
A
nice little
nest.
thing to have.
Yes, it was a
Yeah.
nicety as opposed to now
Yeah.
it's something that's it really is
It
essential.
is.
Your people need to be healthy,
Yes.
mentally,
Yeah.
physically, all of the things, right? It's
Absolutely.
no longer just they show up to work and do the work, because there were so many people who lost loved ones
Yes.
during the pandemic, and there were so many people who were fearful every day. My husband works at a hospital and he was
Right.
essential, and every day he
Yeah.
would go to work, he would come home, and I was happy that he was okay and that he
Right.
wasn't sick, and
Oh gosh, I can't even
but he
imagine how
had to.
scary that had to have been. I mean,
Yeah.
I was very fortunate. For me, I had already been working at home, so it wasn't really a shift
Yeah.
necessarily in all of that that side of it. And so having to have, your husband out there on the front lines essentially, and in a hospital where all
Yes.
of it's going on,
Everything.
which then you have that fear of, is he going to get sick, and then was he going to bring that home too? So
Right.
it's like you have all of those that
Yeah.
fear associated with it.
And I don't know anyone who was not impacted by someone
That is true.
passing away that they cared about during that time. So
Yeah.
it just really, the reality shifted.
Yes, it did.
And the pandemic was terrible, but I think that was maybe one of the good outcomes of it,
I
was
think
that it
so
did kind of
too.
shift that mindset.
Yeah. And I think it shifted the mindset for people working for companies too, right?
Yes.
Because there was a little bit of I don't want to say a power dynamic, because you've always kind of had that back and forth
Mm-hmm.
between sometimes it was an employee
Employer.
market and
Yep.
sometimes an employer market. But
Yeah.
this was different because all of the sudden people were like, my family is what's most important to me. My
Yes.
personal health, my well-being, this is what's first important to me. And then, yeah, I need this job. Like we'd be silly if we all acted like somehow we were going to like live off love or something. We have to have a job. And
Right.
so, but is it okay now for that employer to maybe take advantage of you in the way that maybe they would have, and you would have tolerated it in the past out of fear of
Right.
maybe coming in? So you wouldn't have shared with your employer if you had a personal health crisis in most cases, right?
So true.
You certainly wouldn't have shared with your employer if you were suffering from mental health challenges.
Right.
That was just all very taboo, and you didn't bring that into the office.
Yeah.
Now suddenly, those are all topics that are being talked about, and how
Right.
do we handle all of that?
Yeah.
Hence where human resources
More
kind of comes
human.
into that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Absolutely.
No, I totally agree. Well, and I'm kind of thinking a little bit, like when we think about that tactical side of human resources, there's still a component that has to be tactical, right? I mean, because we still have to have
Absolutely.
paperwork, even if it's electronic. It's
Mm-hmm.
still have to get people hired. You still have
Paid
those,
and
yep, got to get paid, got to
yeah.
have benefits, all of those. So
Yeah.
there's always going to be that side of it. But let's think a little bit about like, how can HR step up up and be more strategic in the role, even from things like change management, which is such a critical component and was never really an integral part of human resources, right? And
Yes.
so thinking about how do you become a strategic business partner?
The Delta Principal is proud to sponsor the HR Her Resources podcast. If your organization is embarking on a digital transformation or navigating organizational change, the Delta Principal is here to support you. With over 17 years of expertise in organizational change management, we're eager to collaborate, educate, and partner with you to ensure a successful transformation. We now also offer personalized change management coaching and classes tailored for employees on navigating change and for leaders on effectively leading change. Please reach out to us by emailing info, at thedeltaprincipal.com. And please follow us on LinkedIn.
So, Cyndi, let's talk a little bit about what do we mean when we say HR being more strategic? So, talk a little bit about from your perspective, like when we say strategy, what does that mean? So, tell me what your
Yeah.
thoughts are around that.
Yeah, it means a lot of different things, honestly. But one of the things that, and I've seen this in more than one study, where a couple of the bigger things for HR to be involved in and instrumental in are change management. So,
Yeah,
got to give a shout out there.
absolutely.
But also in leadership development. So, how
Oh,
kind of full circle is this,
yeah.
right? Where HR historically did not have a seat at the table. Over the years, we have evolved, or they have evolved
Yes.
to be having more of a seat at the table. And now we're even saying, hey, we'd like for you to be involved in developing your leaders, supporting your leaders. I
Yeah.
mean, leaders get to where they are because they're, for the most part, they're good leaders.
Yeah.
But they need guidance, support, and
Yes.
help when it comes to the people side of things as well. So
Absolutely.
I think that's a big part of the strategy. I also feel like HR is now required to understand more of the business objectives too.
Yeah,
So,
that's true.
what are our numbers that we're
Right.
trying to hit? Who are
Yeah.
our customers? How do we reach our customers? How do we upskill our employees when it comes to things like digital technology and
Right.
now AI and
Yes.
all the things, right? So I feel like HR is instrumental in all of those conversations. The one thing that I would say is I don't think there can be an expectation that HR is an end all be all. So I also
Yes.
kind of see them as like a liaison
Yeah.
between, if we're asking about AI as an example, and we
Yep.
want people to get upskilled. So how can you use AI in your job? We don't want to replace people altogether, but there are some processes, there's some, tactical things that
Yeah.
AI can assist with. So how do we upskill people with that? Well, they're going to have those conversations with leaders, with managers, with employees to say, what
Right.
can we do? What do you need?
Yeah.
So they really are kind of the liaisons in a lot of these conversations, and with through the lens of people.
Right. No, I
So,
like that. And I think that's a really good point because even one of the things that we also saw that came as a result of all the changes that have occurred has been more pressure on managers today. So
yes,
especially on
yes,
frontline managers, right? Because suddenly you are now in a position where you're expected to be like coach, mentor, sometimes psychologist.
yeah,
All of a sudden there's this expectation, and yet we've not really trained any of those people because
yeah,
most people become managers because they're good at their jobs, not necessarily because they're great
leading
managers,
people.
right? Yes,
Yeah, for
exactly.
sure.
And so what are we doing, and what role can HR play in making sure that we're providing the proper skills,
Yeah.
or maybe even looking at how do you restructure the organization so your only career path isn't to move into management when management isn't what you want to
Yeah,
do.
like more broad
Yeah.
than, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because if you think about career pathing, it's always, okay, well, I go to
What's the
here,
next
then
rung
here,
of
then
the
here.
ladder?
Yeah, and all of a
Yes.
sudden you find yourself, I remember for, some of the companies that we've worked for in the past, like we'd promote these engineers into managers, and they're not good people.
They
They're
don't
engineers
want to be.
because
Yeah.
they are. And so even shifting that mindset
Yeah.
that being a good manager doesn't mean that you have to know everything about what you even do in that department. It really is kind of more about leading people and understanding how to lead through change and process and all of that. And so talk a little bit about how you see HR playing a role in all of that, and how can they help organizations maybe even understand that? Because I don't know that senior management quite understands that yet.
Yeah. And I think, to your point, I think middle management, frontline management is integral
Yeah.
because they are the ones who are getting the vision from the leaders. They're the ones who are hearing the feedback from the employees.
Yes.
So they have to sort of share what that vision is in a way that the employees will understand. So they have to be good communicators.
Right.
They have to be good at resistance mitigation or hesitation. They have to be good at sort of sharing that vision in a way that it means something to you. It means something to me.
Yeah.
You know, what's in it for me, the whole with them, all of that, right? So HR, again, I think it's, you know, the people who are really good at HR are the people who they recognize that that is a challenging position, and they take a look at what can we do to upskill our managers, to support our managers, or maybe this person really shouldn't be in this position, and how do we respectfully, graciously move this person into another role in the organization that they can feel that they have an impact. You know, people don't leave companies, they leave managers, right?
True. Yeah.
So if if HR can arm people, those managers, with what they need, then that's going to be helpful, or put them into a position where they feel that they can be impactful.
Yeah.
You know, overall,
That's
it really does have more of a holistic.
I like that one. I liked what you said too about the idea that you can't think of HR as being the be all end all either, because there is, I think, sometimes this reliance on, well, where's HR in all of this? That HR really should be there to provide the foundation and the structure and maybe the resources, but you still have to deliver the message as a manager. You still have like, there's shared responsibility throughout the organization, and we all play a part in how that all comes together. So I like that you said that too, because it's too easy then. And that's honestly how HR became the scapegoat in many times as well, because it's like, well, this was an HR decision.
Here comes HR.
Here comes HR. Yes. And so I think that a really bad name happens around all of that. And that's where a lot of that distrust comes from too, right? Is that employees think that HR, they literally are just the bad guys there to do the evil work of that leadership team or something. So no.
And I always felt an onus to the employees when I was in HR, and I was always very proud to get to represent employees or help them through stuff. But you know, I think I probably, when I was in HR, took on more than what I should have.
Right. Yes.
You know, and I was a generalist. I was an HR business partner. I was an HR manager at one point. It was just, you cannot be the end all be all. But to be able to provide the resources or direct people, no matter what position they are within the company is key.
I think that's really true. And I think having that voice. Well, you got some interesting stats as well, because there are a couple of real experts out there in the space today. And as we talked about, there are some male voices in all of this, but
they're great,
they are really great. So I don't want to take anything away from what they bring to it. But like Dave Ulrich, I know he recently put out a study that kind of referenced the competencies of HR and how that has shifted, because as managers and leaders have to evolve, so does HR, right? So talk a little bit about some competencies that we're seeing, because in your role in guiding companies and guiding even HR departments, you probably are thinking about what kind of core competencies do they need in order to be the HR of the future as well.
Right. Well, something, and I'm just looking at my notes here because I want to make sure that I'm referencing him correctly, but one of the things that Dave Ulrich said was that competencies for HR has shifted from adjectives to and nouns to more verbs. Which
I love it.
I love that, right?
Yeah.
And as I was reading through that, I thought, well, that is such a cool way of thinking about this. So what he says, mobilizes information, advances human capabilities through elevating talent, championing diversity, equity, and inclusion, fostering collaboration, accelerating business through influencing the business, driving agility, generating competitive insights, and simplifying complexity.
I mean, like that.
If that's what an HR role is now,
right.
that's pretty exciting.
That is pretty exciting because that is not what HR was. I mean,
Not long ago.
no, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Not that long ago. That
Yeah.
certainly was not the role that HR was playing in all of this. And so
Yeah.
if I were starting in the HR profession today, I'd be pretty excited about it because I might have actually sought out a career in HR if this was what the role
Yeah.
was. Like, I don't know that I would have wanted to be, in well, I know I didn't want to be in HR back when I thought, oh, well, this is much more tactical and paper pusher. But when you look at this, that's exciting. I mean, you
Yeah.
really kind of get to have a seat at the table and be a voice, which wasn't
That's what
that
I
common,
love.
right?
Yes.
Yeah,
And
no.
that's part of what I love about what we're doing too, because I
Yeah.
feel like we'll be able to bring some people to the table who are thought leaders.
Right.
Whether you know them or not, we know who they
we know
are.
who they are. That's right.
I'm excited to get to talk to some of these
I am
folks
too.
and,
Yes.
just to hear their transformation, their evolution
Absolutely.
over, from a tactical into more. And I do feel like sometimes they're flying the plane while they're building it. You know?
Yeah, that's fair. I think that's really fair. And I think probably as employees, we oftentimes have unfair expectations of leadership in general, right?
True.
We
Very
just
true.
assume, well, if
They're
you're at
superhuman.
this seat,
Yeah.
you must know it all, right?
Yeah. Where's your cape?
That's right. What do you mean you don't have it all figured
Yeah.
out? And we have a lot of, because, you think, well, you're the leader, you should have it all figured out, but they don't.
They're
And I
human
think
beings, too.
yes, they're human as well.
Yeah.
And having a little grace around all of that, I think, is probably a good lesson for all of us. So
Awesome.
no, that's great. Well, I can't wait. I think we're going to have some amazing people on here. You and I have talked about so many of our guests, and I'm super excited. And if there are any of you out there who might have an
Yes.
interest in being on our podcast,
I would love that.
yes, we will make
Let us
sure
know.
to share how to get in touch with us. And we would love to have you on our show. And we hope you will subscribe and tune in and share our new podcast.
I'm excited to get
Me
to do this
too.
with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Well, we will see you all on our next episode.
Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of the HR Her Resources podcast. We're so happy to have you with us on this journey. Music and production by Logan Misegadis of LJM Productions. We'd also like to thank our intern, Lauren Banas, for creating our logo and supporting our social media postings. If you'd like to connect with Logan or Lauren, you can find their information in the show notes. If you found value in our discussion and think someone else might as well, please follow and subscribe to our LinkedIn and share with a friend. Until our next episode, please take care and continue to support one another.